Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Community Connection. I'm one of your hosts, Vicki Alorcia Casella, licensed professional counselor in Easton, PA, joined with my wonderful co-host, Mark Kenny from Chestnut Hill College, and our special guest today, Ken Smith, who is a clinical supervisor from IU20. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're very excited. So before we dive in, I'm just going to share my usual disclaimer. So if anyone who is listening or watching is really, struggling with any type of symptoms or concerns, please reach out to your therapist, doctor, caseworker, hospital, crisis, whatever support you have. You're more than welcome to reach out to us as well. But you are not alone. There's a lot of us struggling right now. So please just reach out for help in some way. So Ken, tell us a little bit about your position and your role with the IU20.
Sure. As a clinical supervisor at the IU20, at Colonial IU20, I oversee three main programs. The first program is a community school and home-based behavioral health program. Many people refer to as BHRS services. But basically a homeschool community-based program. I also supervise what we refer to as our ABA services. So these are behavioral services that the districts often utilize us for report writing, consultation, training. And then I oversee a group of school-based social workers who who provide either individual or group counseling, training, parental support, in a number of our districts. So it's basically a three-program supervision.
That's wonderful. Okay, let's dive into the questions. Mark, would you like to lead us off?
Yes. So Ken, with that breadth of experience and connection in the community, in what ways has COVID-19 impacted our families and our homes?
I think that the issue with what every family that I've been in contact is going through is the abruptness at which they were put in this situation to deal with. I think if we had the ability to kind of train families, provide the resources, and gradually, support families, I think that would be the ideal. But many families were dealt with this hand, in a 24, 48-hour period. So there was a lot of uncertainty. So really the stress from the uncertainty and the abruptness is really what families were dealing with. I think everyone was in a pretty good routine at this point in the school year with the school routine, the work routine, the after school routine, and in one fell swoop, all that changed. And there was just a lot of uncertainty and then related stress. So everyone was scrambling to try to make a meaning out of it and try to find that new normal. And I think we're certainly at that point now with many families, but it was definitely a struggle early on.
So you may have already answered our second question, but what are some of the most common concerns that you are seeing families struggle with right now?
So I think, I think it's the what if my, I work in the behavioral health field, so I deal with families. What if my son or daughter has a crisis? What does that look like? Is that different than the last crisis they had when I had all these resources? I had some families had the ability to call therapists to come out to the home, bump up appointments, talk to the psychiatrist, and the what ifs. What if there's a crisis? What if I don't go back to school? What if I don't get my job back? All those things really have impacted families. That uncertainty I mentioned earlier, but we deal with some unpredictable scenarios from a behavioral standpoint, and certainly a change in schedule like the COVID crisis has given our families. That's certainly a common trigger in the population I deal with. The change in routine is a major stressor, and the unknown.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how have you been hearing or experiencing how parents are also trying to balance their other roles besides, along with being a parent at home altogether. So
Yeah, I
how
mean,
has that been impacting as adults try to balance their other roles besides being a parent in these
one
situations?
of the things that in my program, in the community home and school based services, early on, our insurance companies and counties supported a telehealth format. So right off the bat, probably within the 2-week period, all the rules regarding telehealth were reduced, and all the providers had the ability to connect with families virtually. So that was a great coming together of minds and allowing this to happen. But the delivery of virtual is great in some situations and not great in some situations. So I think families, after that initial week or two, where they were trying to make sense of it all, they were then inundated with all these resources. You know, the school says we're going to do this, and the community-based mental health says we're going to do this, and everyone was coming together, and that's a great thing to come together and offer all those things. But I think that the families were quickly overwhelmed with we have school supports available to us, we have community-based supports available to us, and I have a job to maintain. So it's interesting in my role as a supervisor. I was able to pop into some classrooms of students that I support and supervise the staff for. And it was great in some classrooms. And in the classrooms I predominantly support tend to be the autistic support classrooms. And those are probably one of the more challenging populations in the Zoom format, because they tend to the kids tend to be easily distracted. They have a routine. This is not a routine, so getting them adjusted to the routine of a computer. But in the classrooms that I observed, it was great to see a screen full of a student sitting on the lap of a parent and really trying their best to make it work. Yeah, so and knowing that in my consultations with teachers, they understand, because the teachers themselves are dealing with the family in the background, and trying to teach, and the student has a parent who's also trying to work. So it was very much it was a collaborative effort, but it was one of patience and tolerance and understanding, and really there was never any issues pertaining to, if a student couldn't sit for longer than a 15-minute window. Everybody kind of understood that, and really the teachers are very creative, and my clinicians were very creative in trying to find ways to engage them in different types of modalities, both in the virtual format and then things like homework and related to their session. So interesting things in the last couple weeks.
Yeah, yeah, and that gets us to the question about, how maybe twofold, what has evolved, because we're kind of creating a playbook as we're going along. It sounds like people are being innovative in the moment, and they're finding out how that adaptation then works better through this modality than face-to-face. And how about communication? So what have you seen as people's successes, and what would you offer as techniques to families to help improve that communication within their family, and also the communication with the support services?
Yeah, I think as it relates to communication, and some of the trainings I do at the IU, it's funny how all of the trainings kind of revert back to communication. I do a training on the LEAP philosophy, which is a conflict resolution concept. And the first word in LEAP is to listen. So it's very much a communication focus. I do a training on suicide awareness and prevention called QPR, and the Q stands for asking the question. So it's a communication focus. I've recently, within the last couple of years, I went through a year-long training on a family systems approach called ecosystemic structured family therapy. And all that is about communication and active listening. So the listening component is basically first and foremost in all of the trainings that I present on. Even when I go into some of my behavioral trainings with teachers, I always focus on approaches that occur before the behavior. And the main technique that I stress is communicating with your students and understanding your students. So what I see as the challenge is just maintaining that focus on communication. I think I have a colleague at the IU, Dr. Ron Prater, who does trainings on mindfulness. And that mindfulness, that being in the moment, I think it's very important because I think you're a better communicator in a stressful situation if you have the ability to step away and then to come back. So that's kind of the ongoing nature of what we're dealing with. It's not just a power outage for 4 hours, you know. In essence, it's a power outage for 4 months, and to sustain that good practice of communicating and listening is really a challenge.
And it sounds like it's wonderful modeling then for the families, because then they can take that modeling and apply it within their family dynamic and practice that listening there. So it sounds like it really works both ways. It's very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the techniques in the family therapy approach I mentioned are called enactments. And enactments are just simply activities families can do together in a very structured way to reconnect. And sometimes doing things like making brownies or, playing, hopscotch in the driveway. Those things that sound silly, that sound like, we've done that before, but sometimes that reconnection in doing those acts together. And I always stress to families when you do those enactments, that's not the time to get as much out of the enactment as possible. It's much better to end successfully than to get another 10 minutes and have it fail. So to be really cognizant of how it's going and always to end positively, which is always the challenge because extended activities always lead themselves to the potential of conflict. So you have to be really mindful of that.
Wonderful.
Such great information. So our next question was to ask what are some specific things that families could do to reduce conflict, but I think you kind of already answered it, because it's if you're mindful of that communication that you're using and the things that are occurring before the potential conflict, then you're essentially reducing or avoiding the conflict. Or is there something else?
No, absolutely. I think, from a behavioral standpoint, you want to put people in the position to succeed. And having that communication up front, having that expectation, something as simple as, I also stress in this time of need where everybody's schedule is up in the air, the more consistency you can bring, the better. For some populations, like the autistic population, doing visual schedules, making sure that they understand what they're going to do today. And it may be new for them, but at least they have a reminder. All those scenarios, all those strategies put people in the position to be successful versus having a kind of a schedule that is open to interpretation, that ends abruptly, doing new things, and then it just creates a lot of uncertainty and stress, as I mentioned before. So absolutely, communication up front, clear expectations, being mindful of when you need to step back because you are in an uncharted territory with the extent to which some families are interacting with each other on a consistent basis.
So you're providing resources, the schools are providing resources. are there recommendations that you or the IU point families towards to also bring in? I mean, there's so much out there to kind of distill. What are the suggestions or recommendations that in terms of books or short YouTubes at this point? Sometimes we don't have time for that, but may have time to listen to something for a quick 5-10 minutes to kind of just get either reinforced or affirmed what they're doing and encouraged to keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, everybody is coming up with resources and emails and links, and all those things are great. But I know I was overwhelmed in putting together resource lists for my therapist, and I didn't want it to be white noise. Here's another link, here's another link. And I got to a point where I was now filtering the resources presented to me, and then taking out the links that I thought were relevant, and then sharing them in a more structured way with my therapist. But I think a good practice for parents would be to make sure you are checking out some of the state websites. So the Office of Developmental Programs, they've been a great source. They do that filtering. They're updating us as an IU all the time. So a state resource like the Office of Developmental Programs, local county resources, always great. Northampton County Mental Health and Intellectual Disability, same thing in the Monroe, Carbon Monroe Pike, same location. Some of the national support groups like NAMI is a great resource as far as collecting that information. And recently, and maybe not so recently, but in the state of Pennsylvania, there is an adjustment going on where the county and the state is introducing the concept of systems of care, which is an approach that is really one to kind of take down the barriers between departments and have a lot of cross collaboration. And they have each of the Northampton County and the Carbon Monroe Pike have systems of care departments, and one of their big pushes is to make sure families are supported and to fill those gaps in services. So even if you were to look up your county's systems of care website, that would be a great resource. But yeah, any of those larger ones that kind of collect the information. Also, each of the counties in Pennsylvania have a managed care organization, which is more of an insurance company, but they also are responsible for making sure families have resources accessible to them in ample amounts. For Northampton County, it's Magellan Behavioral Health Services, and for Carbon Monroe Pike is Community Care Behavioral Health Services. There are also very good websites on community resources.
Wonderful.
That's fantastic.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think you make a very good point. There is so much out there. You need some kind of intermediary to help you distill it down, and so that you can know how to get to those resources quickly. Go ahead, Vicki. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I interrupted you. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that from a parent's perspective, it has been very overwhelming, like too much of a good thing, and sometimes you do need someone to kind of narrow it down and just say, okay, instead of looking at this list of 50 options, these are the 5 best ones that will probably be the most helpful. Check these out. Okay, so at least now we have a direction of where to go versus looking at this whole list and it's almost like, well, where do I start? But so much good information. I actually wasn't even aware of a lot of things that you shared. Are there other organizations or groups or like support groups that the IU works directly with?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is it seems like there's 2 parts of a calendar year. there's the resources that are available to families during the school year, and then there is the summer. And sometimes what I will say is that there is definitely a push from the school's perspective to offer 12 months of coverage and of care. So for example, in the social work program that I supervise, the districts have specifically requested that the social workers we provide them be 12-month employees. So they're not following a teacher calendar, and they do that because they recognize that mental health needs don't take the summer off, and especially right now, because we were talking about all those school-based supports that were available, and the family can go to the school and the school can provide all those supports. But there's going to be a time where, and for most of the schools in our area, school is done. A couple of them go later into June, but all those supports are going to be reduced. So I think who's going to pick up the slack is going to be the community-based mental health services. And for this summer, definitely the 12-month social workers. Right now, we're discussing what that role is going to look like in the summer. And all the districts have requested that they maintain contact with their caseload through the summer, even if it's just a check-in to see how things are going. But if it ends up being a session, a family session, individual session, it can certainly be that. Both of my social workers in one particular district are going to have what we're terming office hours. It's going to be communicated to families that the social work is available to talk with families on this day of the week at this time, so that there's a set schedule in case that meets their needs. So the supports in the school year, supports in the summer, my hope is that there isn't that drastic change as it has been in the past. But I am preparing my community-based therapists for an increase in service providing over the summer, because I think there's going to be a small honeymoon period after the school year where everyone's going to take a deep breath, and then it's going to start up again for at least my community-based staff.
I love how you said mental health doesn't take the summer off. I don't think you could be more accurate with that statement right there. Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing thing that we all need to be aware of.
So with summer upon us, what recommendations do you have for families as they navigate now into another time period of uncertainty that they're just venturing into?
Yeah, so I would say be prepared for that second wave. You know, everyone's talking about the potential second wave of infections, and that's a concern. And it's funny, we're here talking today about the stresses as it relates to a national pandemic, but we haven't really talked about the health stresses of this, and that's certainly out there, and people dealing with loved ones that may be in age categories that are concerning. As far as what families should do is they should be aware of that second wave of stressors, of concerns, and know that there are services out there. So if they had a community-based service or an outpatient service that they weren't utilizing to a large degree because of unavailability and just being overwhelmed during the school year, to reacquaint themselves with that therapist and to maintain a regular schedule to preemptively have that session, even if things are going well. Things change quickly, and not just to assume that the beginning part of the summer is going to be how it is throughout the summer. If we go back into a more restrictive scenario in our counties, that's going to then cause another level of stress. So to reacquaint themselves with their county and local resources in their outpatient therapists, community-based therapists, and also to reach out to the school. Although I mentioned before, schools are done, and that has typically been a time for planning for schools. Like I said, those that have social workers are really very much focused on the supports they could provide for families over the summer. The goal really is to make sure, at worst, the services maintain over the summer. We don't want to take any significant steps back. We don't want to come back in September as if it's, the first time they've been in services. So our social workers are motivated to maintain the successes throughout the summer and to make that fall transition, whatever that looks like, as easy as possible.
Right. Yeah,
So
there's a lot of uncertainty about even what the fall is going to look like. We're still, so yeah, good point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good.
So if there's a family that's watching or listening, and they're, saying to themselves, our family's struggling, our child's struggling, what would be the steps that they could take to get set up with some of these services?
So a couple different things. They could always, depending on the age, there are certainly supportive services, for example, that the IU offers for young kids. We have a birth to 3 and a 3 to 5 program called Early Intervention. And that is to identify issues regarding development, educational concerns. They put together a plan, an assessment, and then they also reach out to mental health supports. So as an agency that provides community-based mental health, we get a large percentage of our referrals through early intervention. So that would be the first location I would suggest to contact. There's always the potential of seeking supports through early intervention. If you have students involved in extended school year, then there's always the ability to seek support through the extended school year, where the school can then assist in making that connection with community-based resources. We are one of many providers in the county that do the services I mentioned before. Earlier I mentioned a resource to check out is the local managed care organization. Again, they have the ability to direct families to those resources too. So the early intervention through the IU, local district if you have extended school year, the local managed care organization, and then lastly, the local county mental health and Office of Intellectual Disabilities. They have a tremendous intake department, and they can easily provide supports at the basic level, which would be a case manager, and then at the more involved level, which would be enrollment in a mental health program.
Do you happen to have any phone numbers?
I don't have with me any of the county phone numbers, but if you were to type in Northampton County Mental Health and Office of Intellectual Disabilities, you would find, and same thing with Carbon, Monroe, and Pike, you would find the same information. And again, the county has really changed in the last few years. When I first started in the field several years ago, they did a lot of direct services, and they had a lot of departments providing services. And then over the years, it's kind of evolved to more of a hub of resources, a hub for intakes, and they often initiate programs that they perceive to be in low quantities in a particular area. So like the training I mentioned earlier about the suicide awareness and prevention, that's a training that the Carbon Monroe Pike area offered to providers to increase their ability to train in that area. So they often see where the gaps are and they try to fill in the gaps. But if you were just to simply Google that, you would find their contact information in both areas.
Fantastic. Mark, any other questions that you would like to ask Ken while we have him with us?
No, I think he's really provided us with a vast resource of information and ideas and programs, and I think that's been most helpful, been most enlightening to hear all that the IU has to share, and in particular under the department in which you are the supervisor of. So thank you.
Terrific, thank you.
Ken, is there anything that you would like to add? Any other thoughts, suggestions, or anything for our families or communities who are watching?
No, I think the important thing to remember is that there wasn't a blueprint in March that everyone was provided when we started this, and there continues not to be a blueprint, although there are many suggestions now. I think it's a situation where families need to, like in most situations, they need to understand that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to provide an intervention that goes horribly wrong and to learn from that. I think, you know, everybody, even the most educated and well-versed professional in the field will make a mistake in interventions, and to assume that the expectation from everyone is perfection is incorrect. And there isn't an intervention that I can think of, maybe a few exceptions, where you don't gain some understanding of your family members and other people that you can then learn from and improve upon next time around. There's always a next time around. I always tell my staff that, teachers I work with, and as long as you learn something from it and you don't do the same thing again, you're moving in the right direction. But if anybody had any questions for me or wanted to reach out to me, my contact information is, my office number is 610-515-6469, and that's my office. And then my email address is ksiu20.org. So those would be the two main ways to reach me through the IU, if anybody had any additional questions after this interview.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. So much fantastic information. I know our community will benefit from it, so thank you so much. And Mark, of course, thank you for being a wonderful co-host like always. Thank you to our viewers. Please stay tuned for our next episode coming up next week. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.